Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar in the Jean Monnet webinar series, organized and hosted by Alper Kaliber at Altınbaş University. My name is Esra Kaliber, and I will be the moderator today for the webinar, When the Exception Becomes the Rule, Discussing Emergency Politics. This is a product of the ongoing project, Facing Threats to Democracy Under Conditions of Emergency, Understanding Post-Failed Coup Turkey and its Relations with Europe, funded by the British Academy. This project brings together 6 scholars from Altınbaş University and the University of Birmingham. We will have 4 speakers today. Unfortunately, Matthew Whiting will not be able to participate due to a medical emergency in his family. And the first speaker will be Alper Kaliber, who is an associate professor of international relations. His areas of interest include security studies with particular emphasis on critical and regional approaches, theories of international relations, Europeanization studies, civil society, and the Cyprus conflict. He is the co-author of the book, Is Turkey De-Europeanizing? Encounters with Europe in a Candidate Country. And today he will introduce a theoretical and conceptual framework and talk about current emergency practices. Alper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Esra. I'm very pleased to be speaking in such a or among such a distinguished panel. I will mostly focus on some theoretical and conceptual implications of the theory of state of exception, and try to explain the current regimes, which I call as modular emergencies, drawing on the problematization and criticism of this theory. So Schmitt introduced the state of exception as a systematic set of ideas throughout 1910s and particularly 1920s. And in his books on political theology, 1921, and Dictator, 1922. So basically, the aim was to preclude the disintegration of the German state, because 1920s were particularly characterized for Germany by instability, social unrest, and economic and political turmoil. So according to this theory, sovereign is he who have the capacity to decide on the exception. And when the sovereign decides on the exception, this means the suspension of the rule of law, or the suspension of the norm. To Schmitt was drawing on the Article 48 of the German Constitution, Weimar Constitution, which saying that if in the German Reich, public security and order is considerably disturbed, the president shall undertake all necessary measures in order to restore the public security, even with the aid of military. So in times of crisis and necessity, the Schmittian sovereign can suspend the existing order almost without any limitation. Therefore, for Schmitt, what characterizes an exception is total or entire suspension of the order, existing juridical and political order. When we look at Agambanian state of exception, Agamben, as you know, has revived this concept and developed it in his books, most particularly in Homo Sacer in 1998, and then in The State of Exception in 2005. Of course, Agamben approaches to state of exception as a danger, as a, you know, from more critical perspective. But his understanding of state of exception is really commensurate with Schmittian understanding. Because what characterizes an exception is both Agamben, in Agamben and in Schmitt, an unlimited authority and the suspension of entire order. But what Agamben brings the theory is that Agamben introduces a power political perspective, and he basically states that the state of exception has become, in code, the dominant paradigm of government in contemporary global politics. Actually, this is this has turned out to be a standard position on the left. Many critical authors today, like Ahad and Negri and Neocleous, basically state that the exception has become the rule. The exception has become the norm. But as I will try to discuss, what is globalizing is not the fact that the exception has become the norm, but what is globalizing is the blurring of normalcy and emergency. So in the Schmittian Agambanian exceptionalist view, the norm and the exception is in fact assumed both interconnected and also mutually exclusive. Interconnected because even if the sovereign declares the suspension of the norm, although sovereign stands outside of the normally valid legal system, he nevertheless belongs to it. Because I mean, the sovereign is simultaneously inside and outside the legal system, because the sovereign may suspend the norm or the existing juridical order, yet it is exactly this legal order which gives the sovereign emergency executive powers for its suspension, right? But this interconnectedness is not so much mentioned by Schmitt and Agamben. Rather, they tend to understand this as mutually exclusive categories. Because when the suspension of the rule of law is declared, we cannot speak of norm, or the norm cease to apply, right? Or when the norm is full of in full force, according to this exceptionist view, we cannot talk about the existence of the state of exception. Yet, due to different reasons, this fictitious dichotomy between the norm and the exception is not reasonable or is not justified anymore. current emergencies are structured around more complex constellation of the norm and the exception, right? It is observed that executive authorities today employ smarter and more complex and modular emergencies, where the norm and the exception have commingled and intertwined in legal constitutional systems. So exceptionalist practice of states are not only regulated and legitimized through constitutional or legal clauses distinctly dedicated to emergency rule, but several emergency clauses are embedded in or hidden in clause or common regulations, ordinary legislation, laws, so on and so forth. In fact, the contamination of normal running of national juridical systems or emergency powers is not new. I mean, even in 1982, for instance, the Quaestio report prepared for the United Nations talk about this and how current emergencies have turned out to be modular and more complex emergencies. Again, William Schuerman reveals that, or mentions a report drafted by a group of liberal Senate US senators in 1974, revealing that the US law included at least 470 significant emergency statutes without any time limits, and delegating to the executive extensive executive powers. And also current constitutions can have different emergency regulations. I mean, in some constitutions, like in the Netherlands or Portuguese, we have different states of emergencies. We have, for instance, they distinguish between state of emergency, state of war, state of siege, and so on and so forth. In Latin American countries, in some of them, we can again distinguish 9 different levels of states of emergencies. And when you look at the current practices in Turkey as well, by the way, how many minutes do I have? Yeah, I mean, when we look at the...
You have 3 minutes, Alper.
Thank you. When we look at the current emergencies, actually they are modular. I mean, thereby following Mezohai and some other scholars, emergency and rule of law needs to be seen as different yet increasingly intertwined modes of governance, right? And this is a political condition increasingly characterizing the majority of liberal and autocratic regimes today. These commingling or coexisting modes of governance compensate for each other's weaknesses, and together they construct a stable political regime. They are employed as different parts of the modular governance of emergency, with my terminology. And this is, in fact, this is a conscious strategy on the part of power holders for their survival, right? this also brings me to the notion of emergency as a political construction. Well, okay, emergency and state of exception are often regulated through legal mechanisms, but they are in fact not legally fixed. They are political interventions. The meanings of emergency are also changed historically. So the boundaries between normalcy and emergency also is changing. I mean, some practices which we have understood or defined as exceptional can be understood as normal today. So we have the expansion of the exceptional. I mean, consider the practices in airports, you know. So the boundaries are always renegotiated through different practices of executives, and distinction between normalcy and emergency is increasingly blurring. Thereby, we can say that Turkey is also stuck in such a gray zone or blurrity between normalcy and emergency. Although the state of emergency has been lifted in Turkey in July 2018, we can say that there had been many emergency decrees making permanent amendments in laws regulating national health system, education, state personnel regime, so on and so forth. And some degrees are valid for the 3 years as well. And some of them made, again, permanent changes in laws. And some emergency practices are not also repealed. And governors, for instance, tend to easily prohibit freedom of assembly, you know, like we are in emergency. Let me finish here. So just with one sentence, we have the blurring of normalcy and emergency, and also this is an ambiguous gray zone of politics sustained through practices of perpetual securitization. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Alper, for these theoretical insights on the state of exception and emergency and their policy implications. We can now move on to the second speaker, who is Aslı Yılmaz Uçar. Aslı is an associate professor of political science at Altınbaş University. Her research areas are the political economy of administration and history of administration and local governments. She is the co-editor of the book Thinking of Planning in the 21st Century, and her talk is titled Today, Administrative Form of the State of Emergency, the Case of Turkey Through Emergency Decrees. Floor is yours, Aslı.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. Just a minute. So you can see my slides, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank Alper Hoca for his presentation. And I would like to also thank the participants for being here today. Okay. I'm a researcher and also a lecturer in the field of public administration, and I have a particular interest on the administrative system and the administrative history of the Turkish Republic. And today also I will try to contribute to the discussion about the state of emergency from an administrative approach rather than the political, legal, or the social ones. And the title of my presentation is, as you can see, Administrative Form of the State of Emergency, the Case of Turkey Through Emergency Decrees. Okay, I will share the findings of my research, and let me note that all the arguments that will be presented here is tentative and suggestive rather than the definitive and comprehensive. And I started my research with a basic question. Is there a unique administrative form for the state of emergency? How I came up with this research question, when I started reading about the state of emergency, I noticed that there are so many scholars and they contributed much to the topic, but these are all from the political and legal studies. And you also listened to Alper Hoca, and this literature actually is intensive indeed. However, as a researcher of the public administration, what really concerned me was that how the governmental structure and function is being shaped during the state of emergency. Or in other words, actually, is there a unique administrative form of the state of emergency that we can observe in the governmental structure? And let me admit that actually the Agamben studies are the ones most inspired me. So let me start with the basic premises of his studies. As Agamben mentioned, state of emergency is a state of necessity, and it has no law where the constitution or the other laws are suspended. Then in the state of emergency, he said, governments respond to very urgent situation in a political way, and the power of executive gradually expand through the legislative power through the emergency decrees. And he said that actually the emergency decrees constitute the legal and judicial form of the state of emergency, which gives executive full authority to regulate and also change the laws. Okay, again, then try to explain the judicial form of the state of emergency, and he used this concept of state of exception as a dominant governmental paradigm. And at that point, actually, a very relevant question arises for the public administration. If there is a state of emergency, and if this state actually is considered as a governmental paradigm, then can we talk about the administration of the state of emergency, or can we talk about the administration of exception? So my research question actually is being shaped by these basic premises, and actually I asked the question, if there is an administration of exception prevailed during the state of emergency. And in order to respond to this question, actually, I began to search for all the administrative decisions during the state of emergency, but then I noticed that actually Agamben addressed what I have to look for, I mean the emergency decrees. So I conducted a research on the emergency decrees adopted during the state of emergency in Turkey. And let's see. Okay, I prepared a presentation into 3 headings. Actually, first of all, I will share some basic remarks on the research, and then I will share the findings of the research, and finally I will conclude with an argument. About the research, and actually you know that the state of emergency had been declared following the failed coup attempt in July 15 in 2016 and lasts more than 2 years. And during the state of emergency, the number of the emergency decrees adopted was 37. And I mean, what about the emergency decrees? Actually, the scope of the emergency decrees is ranging. I mean, some of them involve 4 or 5 articles with, for example, with annexes, and these annexes include pages. And you know that there are lists of names and the list of names to dismiss from the public service. And there are also some lists of thousands of names of corporations, companies, and organizations to close under the state of emergency. But some of them actually involves hundreds of articles. For example, one of the emergency decree have more than 200 articles. And what we have actually within this emergency decrees, in these actually emergency decrees involving hundreds of articles, they are making so many amendments on several laws. For example, in a decree, for example, National Intelligence Office attached to the presidency, or for example, a new university called University of National Defense was established and brought under the Ministry of National Defense, and etc. So there are so many actually amendments made for several laws. And the findings of the research. Okay, let's see the findings of the research. We already know that from the literature during the state of emergency, the executive power expands through the legislative power. And also, we also know that the suppressive character of the regime becomes so visible in the political domain. But I will leave all these political and also the legal issues behind, and I will try to understand how this governmental structure responds to this actually changing regime, so that I will try to understand how the administrative structure actually is being shaped, so that I found actually 6 important and significant tendencies in the administrative restructuring process during the state of emergency. The first one is the expansion of governmental power over the civil and private sector. And the second one is the expansion of the executive power over the legislative. And the third one is the presidential power over the Council of Ministers, central power over the local governments. The fourth one. The fifth one, the police power over the armed forces. And the last one is about loyal public servants over the others. So each actually topic showing a tendency of the power shift. I mean, how the power shifts from between the branches and between the units of the administration. So let's begin with the first expansion of power, of governmental power over the civil and private sector. Okay. You know that there are so many financial measures taken against the civil and private sector to cut the financial resources of the Gülen movement after the failed coup attempt through the emergency decrees. And there are several private companies, associations, charities, TV and broadcasting institutions were closed. For example, in the first emergency decree, government authorizes the closure of the below institutions. So there are, for example, 35 medical institutions, more than 1,000 private schools and charities, universities and trade. They were all shut down by the emergency decree. And there are also other measures taken against these companies and the organizations. For example, all the immovables and assets of the closed institutions were transferred to the treasury. And closed institutions cannot go to courts for any compensation. All public procurements also were terminated with the affiliated companies. And in some cases, trustees or caretakers took over private companies within the scope of the investigations launched. And okay, although all these organizations and the companies were said to be shut down over the suspected links to Gülen movement, we know that actually the decrees are used to order a crackdown on dissent. How? For example, we know that one of the foundations, for example, targeted include, for example, the Association of Judges and Prosecutors, YARSAV, for example, and it is, for example, defined as a secular group that criticized a recent judicial law drafted by the Erdogan's AKP. So, for example, this YARSAV was also shut down by the emergency decree. So this is not actually a pure list that you can say that, for example, all the companies and all the organizations shut down have some kind of links with the Gülen movement. So we know that actually because of all these measures taken against the private sector and the civil society organizations, now all the organizations and the private sector have a fear from being punished because of their dissenting opinions. So by the means of the mentioned ways of control, appointment of the trustees, closure of the companies, etc., the power of the executive also expands through the civil sector and the private sector. I mean, the executive power not just expands through the legislative function, but the executive arms now involves also in the private sector and in the civil society organizations. And in the administrative term, what does it mean? It means that actually all the neoliberal reforms in the name of the privatization and also decentralization of the neoliberal reforms, you know, promoted the civil society organizations and private sector in the previous era. But now with these emergency decrees and with these all measures taken against the private sector, they were all seems to reverse. And the second actually topic was about is about executive power over the legislative. You know that emergency decrees is a means to bypass the legislative process. In Turkish law, the emergency decrees are called as the decrees having force of law in Turkish law. And it's a special form of lawmaking authority delegated to executive branch by the legislative function to be able to respond quickly to extraordinary social and economic conditions. And actually the Constitution of the Turkish Republic limits the scope of the emergency decrees to extraordinary conditions and to necessary matters. But let's look at the practice, I mean, the case of Turkey. Okay, in practice, in Turkish case, actually, the extraordinary conditions continued for nearly 2 years. So every and each regulation was made through the emergency decrees all along the 2 years. And also the concept of the necessary matters is not clear enough. So it is used actually in a wider definition. For example, the winter tires were also regulated by the emergency decree, or for example, within an emergency decree, there are some municipalities established. So it is not actually limited to necessary matters, as I have seen from the emergency decrees. And furthermore, the acts and decisions of the, made according to the emergency decrees had been insulated from stay of execution, so that you cannot go to court, for example, to demand a stay of execution. And there, we know also there's no parliamentary debate held prior to the state of emergency decrees. And also what is striking is actually the alignment of the administrative system to presidential system was also regulated by the emergency decrees. So this is actually a table showing the laws amended by the emergency decrees, and you can see also the number of the changes made in these laws. For example, the personal law of the Turkish armed forces was changed 7 times. And for example, the law on the function and structure of the Minister of National Defense was also amended 6 times. So within these actually 37 emergency decrees, there are more than 1,700 articles. I mean, the total number of the articles exactly about more than the 700 articles. And there were more than 273 laws amended by the emergency decree. So actually this is not limited to extraordinary conditions, and this is not limited to the necessary matters.
Aslı, you have only 1 minute left.
Okay. Okay, so emergency decrees are used to establish a new regime bypassing the legislative process. So the presidential power over the Council of Ministers also is so obvious because emergency decrees have been formulated and approved by the Council of Ministers, meeting under the chairmanship of the President, which is a condition of the state of emergency. And within the scope of the emergency decrees, we also observe that the presidential jurisdictional area and his active position actually advanced. How, for example, there are many for example, National Intelligence Office subordinated to the presidency, or for example, the appointment of directors also granted to the president. So president became operationalized within the executive power and concentrate the power by heading the Council of Ministers. So the position of presidency during the state of emergency became a rule within the Turkish governmental system change. You know, the Turkish governmental system has been changed from semi-presidential to presidential system during the state of emergency, and presidential system has been officially adopted with the referenda held in 2017. I have three headings left, but okay, I'll wrap up in 3 minutes. Okay, Esra?
Maybe two.
Two, okay. And another actually topic is about the central power over the local governments. There were novel methods actually injected to the system with the emergency decrees to suppress the local governments. What is it? For example, an article actually added to the municipality law, and within this actual article it says that if there's a crime related to terrorism, the mayor, vice mayor, and the members of the municipal council is removed from the office or arrested or prohibited from the public service. The Minister of Interior or governor shall appoint someone to this position. This is called as kayyum in media, you know, and most of the actual municipalities were now under the kayyum's authority, actually. And in these municipalities, the budget of the municipality may be transferred to the field units of the Minister of Finance, and the municipal standing committee may be run with the appointed members of the municipality. So actually, we can say that actually the local government and the suppressive measures in terms of the administrative tutelage power actually has been expanded within the state of emergency. And I have also observed that the police power over the armed forces has been expanded because first of all, we have to note that there are so many amendments made in the military administration, and at the actually to conclude, the closed structure of the armed forces actually was dissolved, and now the armed forces was subordinated to the Ministry of the National Defense. So it is obviously seen that these armed forces were downgraded and redesigned to subordinate to the executive function. Whereas the police power actually has been expanded. Like, for example, there are so many amendments about the village guards, and also a new post created as the neighborhood guards, mahalle bekçisi, during the state of emergency. And the last one actually is about the public personnel. You know, there are so many usual suspects in the public service, and they have been punished by the by dismissing them by the emergency decrees, and considerable number of public servants alleged to be a member of the terrorist organizations have been dismissed, and they were deprived of any academic and military titles, and their mobility was deployed. But I would like to note one more sentence. On the other hand, actually, the loyalty in the public service was promoted. How, for example, there are so many actually articles about that we will talk about in the question and answer session maybe. And also armament of the public servants that we can also consider. The prosecutors, judges, headmen, and municipal mayors are authorized to carry guns with the emergency decree. So in a final analysis, what I have seen from the research, conducted on the emergency decrees is actually illustrated in this slide. And we can see that, for example, by the emergency decrees, the legislative power granted to executive function, and within the executive function, we can see that actually the local government's authority now re-centralized through the central administration, and military administration actually is subordinated to the Council of Ministers or the executive function. And in the final analysis, the Council of Ministers are actually now chaired by the president. So there is actually a new role attained by the president during the state of emergency, and etc. And we know that actually, as a concluding remark, all these changes in the administrative structure show certainly an intensified version of centralization of power in the executive power, and also a concentration of power in the presidency, which can be seen as a form of administration, an administrational exception. But we also know that this administration of exception became a rule with all these actually emergency decrees characteristics, but also the governmental system has been changed in Turkey. So we have actually established a new governmental system in terms of presidential system, so that actually all these administrative changes became a rule now in Turkey. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Aslı, for your detailed analysis of emergency decrees and administrative reform in Turkey.
Thank you.
We can now move on to the next speaker, Dr. Adil Usturalı. He's a lecturer at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Altınbaş University again. Adil's academic interests include contemporary political theory, especially with regard to democracy, justice, and legitimacy. And one of his latest publications is Religion in Habermas's two-track political theory. Today, Adil will be analyzing the recent wave of autocratization through the lens of the democratic theory.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just share my screen with you. Okay, so today I'll talk about how we can define the recent wave of autocratization, or recent, you can find it in different names in the literature: democratic backsliding, de-democratization, democratic erosion. But I prefer to use the term autocratization as a move away from democracy. So this work is actually kind of a bridge between empirical data and theoretical political theory, or democratic normative democratic theory. Through the lens of this autocratization, I will try to compare two big sides of a debate in democratic theory, which are agonistic democracy and deliberative democracy. So let me just give you an overview of this work. So first, I will try to explain what does democratic theory have to say about the current wave of autocratization, and how we can identify current wave of autocratization, and is it different from the previous waves of autocratization. So by reviewing the literature and reviewing the actual empirical data, I have identified 5 characteristics of this autocratization wave. To be clear, we are talking about the last decade roughly, or we can start it from 2008, and it's a process that's still going on today. So these 5 characteristics are, I will explain them soon. Legal facade. They have a legal facade. This kind of autocratization seems legal from the outside. It's a gradual and slow process. It's a selective dismantling of democratic institutions. It's usually carried out by populist actors, and when it's possible, it exploits and abuses states of emergency. And I will review with this information that we have gathered, that we experienced for the last 10 years. I will look at the normative theory side of the things and compare what strategies or what substantial normative arguments these two camps of the debate have: agonistic democracy and deliberative democracy. Because both of these theories aim to deepen democracy. They aim to go beyond these limitations of, you can say, aggregative or liberal democracy. But which, and as a result, let me just give you the spoiler. Some elements of agonistic democracy, agonism, worryingly overlaps with some elements of autocratization. So especially Schmittian elements that they borrow from Schmitt. These are therefore, according to my analysis, they are more risky in the face of this autocratization, and as both strategy and theory. And as opposed to the agonistic theory, agonistic democracy, deliberative democracy, which is an umbrella term, represents the very practices that autocratization aims to do away with. So you can see, especially in the long-term data, when you look at the detail, the autocratizing countries are still usually nominally democracies, but because of electoral democracy. But on the other side, deliberative aspects of these democracies are being destroyed. So we'll go back to that point. So let me start with what's special about the current wave of autocratization. So let me remind you these waves of democratization, which was coined by Huntington. And you also have counter waves for de-democratization or autocratization. So as you know, there have been, I'm not going into the detail about these, but there have been several waves of democratization. So most of the literature in the early 2000s was claiming that we are still in the third wave of democratization, which started in 1974, when Spain, Portugal, Greece, and so on became democratized, and it's accelerated after 1990s when Soviet Union dissolved and so on. But for the last, actually it started in as early as 2009, 2010, people are talking about the third wave of autocratization, reverse wave of democratization, which started in 2008. And now it's much more clear that we are actually in this wave. But this is a different wave from previous waves of autocratization. So for example, in the first wave of autocratization, it's the rise of fascism, rise of Nazism, and totalitarianism. Second wave of autocratization is is the age of military coups, military takeover of democracies. But we have a very different type of autocratization. So it's being called rollback, decline, erosion of democracy, recession of democracy, democratic backsliding, but I prefer to use autocratization. I basically adopt Luhrmann's criticism of other terms with adoption of autocratization, because it's not about going back to something like backsliding or and it's fundamentally different from previous ones. So we should have a term that covers both democratic and non-democratic countries. So autocratization basically means decrease in the level of democracy, which can be measured with several different measures. It can be about electoral democracy, it can be about deliberative democracy, it can be about the quality of democracy, and so on. So it's a continuum between full autocracy and full democracy, maybe. But it's just going backwards in that continuum, or moving from democracy side to the autocracy side. So you can have autocratization in United States, which is an established democracy. At the same time, Turkey or Hungary, you can have it in both democracies, old democracies, young democracies, already autocratic countries, already electoral democracies, and so on. So all sorts of countries can experience autocratization. So as I mentioned, the first thing that we can identify about if we ask what's special about the current wave of autocratization, is the legal facade. So the autocratization is usually seems to be just a legal procedure, change of constitutions, gradual increase of executive power, as opposed to military coups, civil wars, other ways of autocratization that we experienced in the 20th century. So we just experience a weakening of democratic institutions through seemingly legal procedures. And it's also called executive aggrandizement, which was exemplified by also Aslı Hoca's presentation before me, from the Turkish example, how executive power has been increased, not overnight, but in a very short period, but also with a legal facade. It seemed to be legal. So 70% of the cases that we have in the last wave of autocratization fall into this category. They are not coups, they are not civil wars, they are just legally increasing executive power, which is called executive aggrandizement. Another point, I think I should be quicker, okay? It's a gradual and slow process. It's not an overnight process. It's not like a military coup. So it's a slow and gradual erosion of democratic institutions. It's difficult to mark a specific date. This is important because it's slow and, you know, everything is happening piecemeal. It's difficult for the people, for the citizens, for the Democrats to organize or challenge or unite against this autocratization. So when you see it, it's already too late, usually. And it's a selective dismantling. Democracy is only partially killed, usually, especially electoral aspects. Electoral institutions are kept in place because these are very important source of legitimacy. But on the other hand, institutions that strengthen democracy and provide citizens with electoral options are weakened. So you have superficially democratic country, but if you go into details, if you look at the details, people don't have many options. The already predominant party or the actors of this autocratization are basically empowering themselves at the expense of the opposition. And another important aspect is the existence of populist actors. Populism, of course, is a very hotly debated term. I'm not going into detail about it, but even if you use a very widely accepted definition of populism, most, or actually almost all of the countries that have undergone autocratization between 2008 and 2018 have a populist who's holding the office of prime minister or president, who's holding the executive power. And finally, states of emergency. Whenever they have, these populist leaders have the opportunity, they abuse states of emergency in order to justify selective dismantling of democracy and give it a legal appearance. So 1/3 of all the cases that are under the scope of this study or under the scope of this wave of autocratization have experienced states of emergency. And all but one of them have experienced democratic breakdown. So when you have autocratization and at the same time you have a state of emergency, it's almost certain that your democracy will die. So maybe Turkey is one example. Hungary can be another example. You have, it's not like a big number of cases, but it's important to see that almost all the cases that are autocratizing die, democracies die when they enter into a state of emergency. So in the light of this empirical data, I have reviewed this normative democratic theory debate, which has been going on for a couple of decades now, between agonistic democracy and deliberative democracy. Why? Because I think both of these theories are relevant for today's autocratization wave, especially agonistic democracy, because agonistic democrats are using or proposing that we use some strategies that are also used by populists or autocratizers.
Adil, you just have 2 minutes to wrap up.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I've been too slow, maybe. Let me just be quicker. So agonistic democrats have used, proposed a Schmittian framework. Basically, they adopt the term state of exception and friend-enemy distinction. So basically, all political conflicts are between friends and enemies, but instead of just violent conflict, we should just recognize each other as adversaries. But other than that, there is no established norm. And very important factor, irreconcilability of democracy and liberalism, that's also adopted from Schmitt. This is adopted in the Emergency Politics book by Bonnie Honig, and she's proposing basically a use of some opportunities that are given by states of emergency and turning them into more progressive or more radically democratic opportunities. As opposed to Agamben, for example, as Alper Hoca mentioned, she promotes taking advantage of opportunities provided by states of emergency. And another point, which is called the democratic paradox, which is basically the irreconcilability of democracy and liberalism, is also adopted by Honig and also Mouffe. Chantal Mouffe is a very important representative of agonistic democracy, and her recent book, For a Left Populism, proposes that we should hit right-wing populists with their own weapons. This is a populist moment. Let's have a left-wing populist leader and unite around him or her, and then maybe we can destroy or we can stop autocratization. But there are lots of problems with it. I wish I had more time. I should have managed my time better, but basically there is disconnect between strategy and substance of theory in agonistic democracy, and it's challenging how to promote inclusion while at the same time advocating a strategy that's by definition exclusive. So populism is by definition an exclusion, based on exclusion. It's about us versus them. So, but it's at the same time claiming to be an inclusive, radically democratic theory or strategy at the same time. So that's a very challenging point and risky theory, according to my analysis. Let me just briefly mention deliberative democracy side, and which is, as I said, it's a huge literature, but I'm specifically referring to a specific camp within deliberative democrats. You can say it's a public reason tradition. Main representatives are Habermas, Rawls, Ben Habib, Ryan Forst, and others. And there's a huge emphasis on the power of the informal public sphere. And when you look at the autocratization wave is basically trying to destroy all the exchange in the public sphere. So they are trying to dislocate citizens from participating into political sphere. And basically deliberative democrats are trying to do the opposite. And as opposed to the Schmittian democratic paradox, which was democracy and liberalism are irreconcilable, deliberative Democrats, especially Habermas, is proposing that private and public autonomy of citizens are co-original. Basically, to put it more clearly, rights, individual rights, human rights of citizens, and public political rights, public sovereignty, are recognized at the same time. One of them is not above or below other. So I had to skip some points, but basically, empirical knowledge suggests that autocratization adopts lots of agonistic tactics and suppresses deliberative practices. And for this reason, I'm saying that agonistic democracy is a risky strategy and risky theory and conflicting theory to adopt under the wave of autocratization, because it ignores public sphere, ignores deliberative practices. And the problem is not only strategic. Another point, maybe this point should be elaborated further in another place. This agreement is much more fundamental than strategic or tactical. It's about much deeper philosophical disagreements about the concept of autonomy and about the understanding of public sphere or the political. Okay, I wish I was sort of okay with my time.
Yes.
Maybe we can go on in the question and answer phase. Okay, thank you.
Sure, we can add it. Thank you for covering such a large ground. I'm sure your talk will bring up questions and comments from the audience. But before the questions, we will move on to the last speaker of the webinar. She's the last speaker, but this will not pose a problem for her due to her usual energy and dynamism. So Didem Soyaltın Kolela is a lecturer at Altınbaş University. She's assistant professor of political science. She specializes on public policy, policy transfer, and good governance, international and national anti-corruption regimes, as well as EU-Turkey relations. Her book, Europeanization, Corruption, and Good Governance in the Public Sector, The Case of Turkey, was published by Routledge in 2017. And today she will be focusing on emergency politics and judiciary capture in Turkey.
Thank you, Esra. Hope you can all hear me well. We have a very strict chair, so I will immediately start sharing my screen with you. Hope it works. So I see many overlaps with the previous speakers, so maybe I will, cut some parts short when I'm talking about judiciary capture today in Turkey. So in my case, I want to contribute to this research on emergency politics and the discussion with the Newton Project by focusing on judiciary capture in Turkey. In my case, emergency politics comes as a legitimizing device for politicians to adopt some amendments which capture the main judicial institutions. And I guess already Adil mentioned it very well, and this happens behind the legal facade. So Adil made my job very easy in that sense. My research starts with some kind of a puzzle, and I, sort of came up with a research question. So when I look at the rule of law promotion, especially after 2006, when EU, opened accession negotiations with the Western Balkans and Turkey, it became really more comprehensive. There are 2 chapters now dealing with rule of law related issues. They are sort of, more detailed. There are some new tools like benchmarks. Commission is looking at these benchmarks, whether countries can reach them when they decide open and close an individual chapter. And there are some new principles such as fundamentals first, irreversibility, which mean that countries should should be done with rule of law related reforms in the very early phases of the negotiations, and this reform should be put in practice. So when we look at from this perspective, I was expecting, you know, things will be better in accession countries, but in Western Balkans and Turkey, things are not going in that direction. So I guess in Turkish case, I'm a bit concerned now to use backsliding, Adil, but I guess I will still keep my presentation as it is. So rule of law backsliding, let's say, or, you know, erosion of rule of law, judiciary capture is going on. Although we observed some kind of, you know, technical reforms, improved judicial efficiency, modernized courthouses before. And this sort of came with the Europeanization process. So my research question comes in that way, how it is happening, you know, how does such kind of a comprehensive, revised rule of law promotion generate some adverse outcomes? So I think this is sort of tried to address by some scholars. I'll come that point in a minute. But the second part of the question, I sort of added after I received some feedback from Birmingham when I sort of presented a similar research outcome there. How do governments get away with it? Adil, Aslı, they all mentioned, you know, this process, state of emergency decrees, changing structure of the administrative form. I think I should include judiciary there, or, you know, this legal facade, gradual and slow process of erosion. But how do governments get away with it? Sanctions are not working, or public support, why they are not losing public support? So I will try to reply these questions by looking at some kind of theoretical framework. I try to bring some insights. So when I look at Europeanization or external rule promotion, scholars already tried to address similar questions. So I'm not the only one, obviously. So they are trying to look at pedagogical effects, you know, how EU's incentives, rewards, empower wrong hands, illiberal forces. So these governments use these rewards, incentives coming from the EU to cut power of the veto players, to shuffle power balance in the bureaucracy. This happened as well in Turkish case. But my point is, we are not talking about positive incentives in Turkish case anymore. So it's over. So we are now talking about negative incentives. We are talking about, so when I say sanctions, it may be a bit too much. That's why I say social sanctions. Generally works through naming and shaming a country in front of, you know, its peers. So there are too many critics coming from European Parliament, you know, freezing of accession negotiations voted in the Parliament, from the General Affairs Council, cutting funds for the Turkey. So these are all I frame as social sanctions, and we don't know much how they work, when they work. So that's my theoretical explanation comes in. I try to, I argued it in another paper that is coming up in these days in the International Political Science Review. So I try to show how EU sanctions, mostly through, you know, working naming and shaming procedures, promotes adverse effects. So I argue that they may lead to these unintended consequences when political costs are high at home. So this cost can be related with elections, can be related with political turmoil, or some kind of power rift between government and political rivals or opponents. So in such situations, governments are more likely to use emergency politics, the politics of fear, for example, to justify authoritarian measures, so extend their power in the judiciary, you know, change the structure in the administration. And I guess this is also happening in the legislative branch, but I try to focus on the judiciary. And in a way, they even manage to mobilize public support for their political agenda. And this generally happens by instigating the rallying round to flag effect. So they, you know, blame the external actors, provoke this nationalist pride, these nationalist feelings, and they show themselves as the only one who can bring political stability. So that's how I try to explain how governments can get away with this kind of capture or such kind of democratic backsliding in the countries. So when I look at the reward sanctions from the EU for Turkey, I guess we are all aware of this conditionality, you know, credible, material, positive incentives, at least until 2006. So Turkey received candidate status, opened accession negotiations. It was the biggest beneficiary of the EU funds. So it worked well for a while, but I guess it just promoted some surfaced in legal reforms, somehow changed things in the judiciary and key judiciary bodies. But negative conditionality is, I guess, more obvious, and it is not very adequately explored in my understanding. Social sanctions, that's how I frame this kind of critics coming from European Parliament, European, EU's General Affairs Council. So when you look at these institutions, you will see that they generally frame Turkey as the outliner, especially in the rule of law issues. European Parliament voted in favor of formally suspending accession negotiations for Turkey. This is obviously a symbolic one. This is not a binding legally, but this happened for the first time in the entire history in the accession process. So I guess this makes Turkey some kind of an outliner, some distinguished as one of the worst cases in the enlargement process. Again, EU cut IPA funds in the new government budget for the coming financial term. And in the enlargement strategy, generally, Turkey received really harsh critics. So when we look at this kind of negative incentives coming from the EU, I guess they just play in the hands of government and allow them to adopt more authoritarian measures and capture public institutions, including the judiciary agencies that I examined. So obviously this reward sanctions story is not the only factor to explain the realities, what's happening in Turkish case. I will come to domestic politics and that's, explain the main puzzle in my hand. But let me summarize what I mean by backsliding. So when we look at the outcome, we will see the rule of law related change in Turkey. I guess in the beginning, it was also, it has a reason why government came up with this kind of reforms, this IT system, modernization of the courthouses, increase of number of judges and prosecutors. So it is sort of close to European numbers now. There's a Justice Academy training, judges and prosecutors. And if you look at their website, you will see they are always referring to European Court of Human Rights decisions. There is also judicial reform strategy. Came in 2009, and it was exactly in line with the recommendations of Venice Commission of the Council of Europe and also European Union Progress Report recommendations. Judicial reform strategy sort of planned a 6 package until end of 2014, but the strategy revised later in 2015 and again in 2019, and it is not even closer that it was planned before. It came, it brought some amendments which are not in line with the Venice Commission anymore. And more importantly, these 2010 constitutional amendments in the High Council of Judges and Prosecutors, the main agency, determining promotion and discipline procedures of the courts and judges and prosecutors, and the Constitutional Court, main legal body for the constitutional review. So these are the 2 important agencies in the judicial sector. So when we look at other countries as well, Hungary, Poland, I guess it's kind of the same. They are also attacking the main judicial bodies, like constitutional courts, I guess the first target. It's same in Turkish case. But 2010 amendments were sort of prized by European Commission, Venice Commission, international legal experts, because it brought greater representation in the judicial and legal profession. There were too many elected judges by peers, not by the executive or president. So it was sort of, in line with European standards. And it gave more autonomy to the judiciary vis-a-vis the executive, although Minister of Justice was still the chair of the council. But still, I guess judicial independence was sort of improved, let's say, again on the paper, I would say, because this kind of amendments just changed the pool where judges and prosecutors were elected, and it played in the hands of government later on. So that's sort of, the positive side of the story, and they are sort of in line with the EU's positive incentives, but the negative incentives didn't create the expected outcomes, but created the adverse outcomes. After 2014, already Aslı mentioned some of these points. High Council of Judges and Prosecutors structure change. So even government confessed itself, they gave too much power and autonomy to Minister of Justice, and they took it back simply. So Minister of Justice terminated the key positions, and they, assigned these positions to, government-friendly judges and prosecutors. And this generally happened in a very informal mechanism of patronage and governmental decrees, especially during the state of emergency. And the main purge came after the coup attempt of 2016, which was organized by a small fraction in the military, which, you know, alleged links with the Gülen movement. So Turkey declared state of emergency and sacked 5,000 judges and prosecutors, and this is almost, you know, 1/3 of the whole sector. And again, after 2017, the council structure changed third time. So the name became Board of Judges and Prosecutors. The number of members decreased again. So it is a step back from 2010. European Commission just mentioned that it just turned into a main tool for government to control judiciary, because it is, you know, how you appoint judges. If you control a board of judges and prosecutors, you can control the whole judiciary sector, and that's what government did. If you look at the election procedure of the new board, you will see majority of the members are elected by the parliament, where government ruling party has the majority of the seats. And again, Constitutional Court, the last veto player, some scholars mention, with the new constitutional amendments, came with the referendum in 2017 April. The competences were crippled, and presidential office power extended into this branch as well. 2018 with snap elections, these amendments came into force, and Turkish parliamentarian system changed into a presidential one. So I guess this is also important to mention, because it sort of institutionalized a permanent state of emergency. Alper already mentioned, you know, this gray zone between norm and exception, where they commingle. I guess that's where happening in Turkish case, you know, institutionalizing and making it look legal on paper. But behind the legal facade, there is, you know, this judiciary capture or state capture, let's say, it's happening. So there are many indexes showing how Turkey is losing points, but I guess Bertelsmann's Stiftung Transformation Index is the most detailed one, because they are looking at rule of law status average by looking at 3 indicators: separation of powers, independent justice, and prosecution. And Turkey is losing point almost more than 2 points between 2012 and 2018. So I guess the propositive reform sort of contributed somehow, at least, you know, to reach 7.5 in 2012, and it went back to 4.3 in 2018. So this is one of the largest decline in the whole index. So I try to you know, I guess the picture is quite clear, but if you want to examine, you know, how this is happening and how governments can still promote their public support or political support even in such kind of an environment, we should examine domestic politics more truly. Emergency politics and feared, I said in the beginning of the talk, you know, they just played in the hands of government. But I guess if you want to understand how this happened that quickly, we should look at the 2010 amendments as well, which were praised by many external observers, because AKP government made this kind of reforms, and, you know, they sort of reshuffle the power balance and eliminate old patronage networks in these 2 key judicial bodies. When we look at the election process, before it was Council of State and Court of Cassation were deciding, you know, who will be a member in these institutions. But with the 2010 amendments, which were, you know, sort of welcomed by many European experts, this kind of pool change, and government had chance to use its informal mechanism for patronage to reassign these judiciary posts. So this kind of, I guess, preparation was important. So during the state of emergency, judiciary capture just took the last shape, in my understanding. So this politics of emergency, this fear, you know, we are the only ones who can provide political stability in the country sort of statements, so enabled the government to justify authoritarian measures, justify this 37 government decrees, as already mentioned, very detailed. And they also sort of, you know, managed to get away with this extensive purge in the judiciary after the coup attempt. So they present these measures as fighting, you know, they are necessary to fight against enemies, as Adil mentioned, inside and outside of Turkey, and outside enemies mostly are European actors. And this is the only way for them to guarantee domestic stability, especially, you know, in the renewal of conflict in the Southeast Anatolia and ISIS-related terrorism. And EU social sanctions just came on time. just critics, I would say. So they were shown as illegitimate intervention into domestic politics, even as a threat to national unity. So in the mass rallies, during the referendum yes campaign, for example, Erdogan slammed the report written by George Hans, using these typical European names to provoke pride of Turkish nation. And so, also mobilize domestic support. And it, I guess, worked somehow. When we look at this yes campaign in the April 2007 referendum and also snap elections, presidential elections in 2018, you will see anti-Europe rhetoric was the cornerstone. So this, sort of instigated the rely around the flag effect and mobilized support for the government, although they are capturing state institutions behind the legal facades. So I guess that's how I try to explain my puzzle, how governments can still empower themselves in such kind of a situation. So I will try to conclude my points with a couple of things, I guess. So rule of law promotion, either through rewards or sanctions, can lead to adverse outcomes, can empower illiberal governments and their authoritarian agendas. And even they can mobilize public support for their ongoing capture. So this is, I guess, very interesting story. And this is sort of ignored or can't capture by European Union institutions. Or they don't want to enter in the murky domestic politics of countries. That's another story. But EU-funded reforms can promote some kind of judicial capacity. They can create some efficiency, as happened in Turkey, as happened in Hungary, I guess, in Poland, in Western Balkans, Serbia, for example, similar, or Albania is similar. But it doesn't mean that they will, turn into judicial independence or impartiality. So this kind of decoupling case, I guess, it's sort of boring, and we should move beyond, how they are still, implementation gaps many scholars try to address, but I guess state capture, judiciary capture is a different story that we should, examine more detailed, I guess. So that's what I tried to do. I look at the domestic politics and I try to see how emergency politics play in the hands of government to justify this judiciary capture. In the paper I wrote for this Newton project, which is on the website, so if you're interested, you can have a look. I tried to come up with foundations and mechanisms of judiciary capture under the guise of EU's rule of law promotion. So judiciary capture, I guess, is not that much interesting in itself alone, but if it's happening under the, under the control of EU's rule of law promotion, it is more and more puzzling. And also this, I guess, very urgent warning outcome for EU as well. And this kind of adverse effects of EU's transformative power that we studied over the years, Europeanization, EU's transformative power. But when we look at the current accession countries, there are alarming situations. There is a rise of illiberal trend. There is also already some kind of authoritarian, semi-authoritarian regimes. And this is not the only problem in the EU as well. There is also, problems in its own member states, Poland and Hungary, which were not sanctioned properly until so far. So when I mention sanctions, I guess you may, or audience may think about the sanctions which were not applied for Poland and Hungary. They are not being sanctioned anyway, so why should EU sanction the accession countries which were not even given a credible accession perspective? So I guess I will leave it here with too many problems and questions. So I think I'm on time, Esra, so I'm just looking at you now. I was a bit quick maybe, but if we have questions and answers, I'll love to reply.
Okay, thank you, Didem, for your empirical analysis of the judiciary capture in Turkey. As a matter of fact, I would like to thank all 4 speakers because they provided an inspiring theoretical framework, and also they provided empirical data about the current state of emergency politics. Now I would like to invite the audience to give their comments or to ask questions. You can write your questions in the Q&A box, or you can use the chat box and type your question. We will see them immediately. And while you are writing up your questions, I will give one more turn. And I'll go back to Alper. Alper, do you want to react to any of the speakers?
Yes, just for 2 minutes. First of all, I learned really a lot, and I mean, all other three speakers have drawn a full picture for us. As you may deduce from all these things, I mean, all these assumptions, the emergency governance and crisis governance are directly related to administrative issues on the one hand, on the other, political and legal issues, and also on the other, directly related and implicated in the democratization issues. I mean, just as a sort of as an assumption from a preliminary research, I can say that, for instance, populist regimes or regimes characterized by autocratization, they tend to use emergency powers more than others. For instance, if you look at the Hungarian government, Urban, prime minister, gained a power to rule by decree the country, you know, in an unlimited time. Again, Trump time to time declare emergencies. These are often local emergencies. I mean, either they can be on natural disaster issues or, you know, this kind of things, or, you know, they can be related with the COVID pandemic process. And also, these declarations could be about the prevention of social unrest and, you know, political demonstrations. But we see that, I mean, even if some emergencies are about, for instance, health issues, the government may exploit or abuse these degrees to prevent people from coming together and demonstrating against some political developments. I mean, for instance, one of the last example for this, the French case, just a few days ago, the French government wanted to prohibit the anti-racist demonstrations in Paris due to the pandemic state of emergency. This emergency was in paper so-called about a sort of health issues or pandemic, or this was mainly a sort of health emergency, but the government's act was totally political. But nevertheless, in France, there's still a sort of high courts or judiciary running, which is still running, and this judiciary declared the government's attempt as illegal. So the French people came together and they managed to demonstrate, protest racism. So, but this shows us that, I mean, emergency legislation is easily used by governments, or governments can easily swing between the normal legislation and the emergency legislation, so that they can easily gain emergency powers. And therefore, emergency powers are practiced and used by governments often more than we think, basically. Yeah, this was my reaction.
Okay. Aslı, do you want to have 2 more minutes to comment on the other speakers? Do you have anything else to add?
Yes, maybe.
Anything you missed to say because of the time limitation?
Yes, but I'll use so much time, but okay. Maybe I can share also the last slide that we can also see how I observed actually the main tendencies of the administrative restructuring. And it is so important that, for example, Adil also emphasized that all this restructuring process has been made gradually, so that you cannot see, for example, how this actually administrative structure now becoming just a compact actually administrative structure, because all these actually restructuring process from legislative, I mean the expansion of the executive power through legislative, through civil society organizations, or through judicial function also has been gradually actually occurred, so that actually what I see from all these actual research and from all this literature, the emergency decrees and the measures taken by all these emergency decrees become really a rule. And actually the Turkish case was so clear. I mean, obviously is a case that we can see this how the exception actually become a rule. So what I can see actually, this picture just shows how actually the administrative system responds to this kind of emergency politics. And also, Didem Hoca also added so much, for example, from the judiciary capture point. And also Adil Hoca also emphasized how this process actually has been made with other actually perspectives. So that's all I have in my mind.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Adil, do you have anything else to add? Any comment or final remark?
Just that I also agree that this has been like the pieces of a puzzle. And I think the puzzle, when we complete the puzzle, we can see that the state of emergency is actually part of a bigger trend of autocratization or decrease in the quality of democracy throughout the world. And I think one thing that sticks in my mind is that I think now it's the time to develop some strategies to about what we as citizens can do about it. How can we think of new ways to maybe new regimes to implement in times of emergency? How to stop exception being the norm? So I think this opens up new venues for this kind of studies.
Okay. Thank you, Adil. Didem, as you might have seen, there is a question from the audience about the European Union and the COVID pandemic. The question is, the European Union has been a little unsuccessful to manage the COVID-19 process, particularly in Italy. It was left alone by the EU. Do you think this did harm to the legitimacy of the European Union?
I mean, COVID pandemic, I guess, EU's legitimacy discussed very heavily in different webinars, and not that much related with the judiciary capture and emergency politics much. But when we look at COVID and how it is used by governments, I was just reading Hungary, you know, how they lifted state of emergency and just came up with new laws, and this is reapplying emergency measures. And when you look at Article 7, which is the only sanction that the EU can use against breach of foundational values by the member states, it was not applied until so far. The first stage was triggered by Parliament and Commission for Hungary and Poland respectively, but nothing happened until so far. So I guess it's already a legitimacy problem in itself, with or without COVID. And COVID just made everything worse and make this, exception became the rule, a phenomenon a bit more, I guess, easily to apply because of the emergency situation itself. It's a health emergency at the end, a state of danger situation. So it just, I guess, gave more room for governments which were already using such kind of maneuvers before. So not in the case of Italy, I guess, the legitimacy case, but Hungary, and especially Hungary, I guess, they are playing into this, emergency politics and fear to empower themselves. And I was just wanted to add on that, maybe to Alper's point, how they are smart. Alper said I took a note, smart and technical. They are using some smart techniques, let's say, to hide such kind of emergency measures into a very long law process, for example, the legislation, I mean. So when you look at the new Hungary's legislation after, lifting state of emergency with the COVID, so legal experts were discussing. So it is very technical, it's very smart, it looks very legal, but when you look at details, it is just empowering Orban more than ever for a permanent situation, like Alper said. So I guess this is quite interesting. They are using such kind of smart technical process to hide in between the lines the authoritative measures. And EU, I guess, legitimacy issue is already a big problem with the Article the 7, which is not being employed until so far.
All right. Thank you, Didem. I cannot see any other questions from the audience at the moment. I will also just check the chat box. Okay. No, we don't have any other. I suppose it's just right time, maybe, to end this webinar today. And before ending it, I would like to thank again the 4 speakers today. Alper Kaliber, Didem Soyaltın Kollela, Adil Ustralı, and Aslı Yılmaz Uçar. Unfortunately, we were missing Matthew Whiting today because of a health emergency. So it was an emergency situation in the family, so he couldn't make it today. But I would like to remind the audience that you can visit the webpage of our project, which is www.emergencyturkey.com. You can visit this page to get more information about the project, to see the working papers, and to see the forthcoming publications. And you can also contact the project team. And the project also has events, seminars, and workshops. And you can see more information about these outreach activities as well. And you can contact the project team via the web page. So I'm going to finish the webinar, and I hope to see the audience for the next one, which is due next Friday. We are going to announce the details about the last webinar of the Jean Monnet project.
Thank you very much, Esra.
Alper, you are muted, so they cannot hear you. Alper, you are still muted. Can you please turn on your mic? No, not yet. Okay. Hang on.
Yeah, can you hear me? No.
Yes, we do now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was saying next panel will be in Turkish, and it will be next Friday, just 1 week later. And it will be about the current role and diminishing influence of international organizations, with a particular emphasis on the governance of pandemic by World Health Organization. yeah, we have a guest speakers, and one of them will be Selim Badur, Prof. Selim Badur, from different, very different discipline. So it will be Turkish, and I hope we will reach a wider audience as well. Yeah. So I also would like to thank to all participants and also to the audience, and just end this session. Goodbye.